Here is Colorverse Tango, as they were obviously huge fans of Sylvester Stallone in Tango in Cash. I can't blame them. His performance there was outside of his normal and truly top notch. This is truly a fire red and has real life on the page, being much more than just a standard red. While it is always enjoyable, there is a very noticeable tone shift as papers change, but it always brings the shading and life to what you write. Now, on non-fountain pen friendly paper, the performance ranges from spot on to really spotty. So test before you go. This isn't a red that I would usually go for, but I really am enjoying it and may be looking to expand my red inks to include a bottle of this.
The pen for today is a Lamy Safari. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
This red is fire. Absolutely outstanding. Really standing out on this bright white paper with no feather, no spread. Only light moments of shading being something that you would have to object to find looking at object on the fourth line, where the T is darker than the rest of the word. It's not false to say that it's shading there. The F of false on the third line is darker than the A, but the LSE at the end do get much darker. This looks extremely nice here, though most of it comes through as a fairly uniform red. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
More than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks.
Here is Colorverse Proxima B.
Here is Colorverse Matter.
Here is Colorverse Quasar. Here is Colorverse Vortex Motion.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
This is a little bit lighter than we have on the Clairfontaine as a tone. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does have some moments of some shading. You see it in cardinality on the first line, where car is a little bit lighter, darkens up during that din in the middle, and the alley towards the end lighten up a bit, but that TY very end, very dark. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see the tone is noticeably lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There are some light moments of feathering that you can see right here and a little here and here. The feathering is not out of control, but it is present. There is no spread. There is some shading going on, more noticeably as a word-to-word thing where letter is a darker tone than the two underneath it. I don't know that this is what I go for just because of the tiny bit of feathering, but I'm probably a bit picky when it comes to that. This I do think is being lightened up because of the tone of the paper, meaning the ink is a little bit translucent. Looking at the back of the page, there are some spots that the ink got quite deep into the paper. Now, never bleeding through touching the page underneath, and probably not stopping you from writing back here because the ghosting is minimal. Just be aware of those spots and check that paper.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade at times when appropriate, like appropriate on the fourth line, where the R is darker than the letters that are around it, and the TE at the end do get a little bit darker. Most important, it does stand out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem. making this a good ink to use if this is the paper you go for. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more red inks.
Here is Eckermann, their number 18. Here is Levenger Fireball. Here is Pen BBS 220.
Here is Scribo Chianti.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that while the tone of the red is the same as the Clairfontaine, it is noticeably flatter as a tone and not as lively a red as it has been. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. You do not have to be a dummy to see the shading. When you look at the DU, it is darker than the MM, but that Y at the end does get to be quite a bit darker. It still stands out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem. This works very nice on this paper, so if you're a student using it, keep up the good work. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Kaweco Midnight Blue. Here is Pilot Kiri Same or Scotch Mist. Here is Jinhao Blue.
Here is Sailor Studio 023.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather. It does spread in a normal way for dealing with copy paper. It does have some shading that's going on. This could be a great second color on the page. Or if you are adding a whole section on and really want to draw attention to it, this ink could be a very good choice. It works well on the copy paper. Looking at the back of the page, there's a number of spots where the ink does get quite deep into the paper. Normal considering that it's copy paper. The ghosting is at a minimum. Could you write back here? I probably wouldn't as a general rule for copy paper, but I think you might get away with it.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
My Lamy Safari has a stub nib and is a medium flow pen. It gives a great living red on the page and some unexpected for red shading. Off camera, I tried this in a wet medium and it got much darker and still shaded well. I really enjoyed this from a medium flow stub, and like what you are seeing, this lively fire-like tone of red with shading is really speaking to me.